You're watching the Law and Crime Network, everyone. We're going to take a pause out of our replay of the top 10 witnesses who stand out in our minds here at Law and Crime from trials we've covered since we signed on the air earlier this year. That was Mike DiPolito testifying in a hearing in Florida against his former wife, Dahlia DiPolito. An interesting case, interesting testimony. We'll get back to some of his testimony in a moment. Before then, though, I want to remind everyone a little bit about a case we covered that wrapped up last week here on the Law and Crime Network. This is a case that involves Shelby Isaac, a teenager from Tennessee who was convicted of killing a man, Eddie Tate Jr., his girlfriend, Edwina Thomas, and her unborn child. That unborn child was 6 to 8 weeks along, and the conviction stood because of a Tennessee law which makes it a crime to kill an unborn child. A number of states have taken the move to add these laws onto the books. Tennessee is one of them. A majority of states have these laws right now. One of the sponsors of the law in Tennessee is Mae Beavers. She's a Republican currently running for governor in that state, and she joins us now live on the Law and Crime Network. Mae, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
So you're on the phone with us, and first of all, I just wanted to ask you, when it came to thinking this law through in the legislature, what went through your mind? Why did you want to get this law passed as one of its key sponsors?
Well, because of an incident that actually occurred back in like 1994, 95. I can't remember exactly. The first time I filed the bill was 1995 because we had an attorney who was killed on Church Street in Nashville, and she was pregnant. And we didn't have a law that allowed them to prosecute the drunk driver for another count of homicide.
So that incident, it was a killing of an attorney, ultimately led to some of the legislative decisions to pass this bill into law in Tennessee.
Right, by a drunk driver.
And out of that situation, which sounds tragic in its own right, that was back in the mid-90s, but the most recent addition to the bill, I think, was 2012. We were talking a little bit yesterday, and perhaps you can help our audience understand why it took so long between that incident and the actual passage of the law for this to move up through the steps in the legislative process.
Well, to be honest with you, I think it was because of the abortion issue, and people were questioning, when does life begin and things like that, but it really didn't have any effect on, the abortion laws at all. This was a woman who had chosen to have her child, and because of a drunk driver running off the street, running off the road onto the sidewalk, she was not allowed to live or to have her baby. So, and then the district attorney could not charge him with a second count of homicide because we didn't have the law on the books at that time.
So it took a long time to go through the legislative process, but ultimately it did become law. And how did it change the previous version of this? Because my understanding is that previously there was a law on the books, but it attached legal protection to an unborn child at a much later date. Do I have that right?
That's right, and that was the problem when we first tried to go through committee with it. And so years later, with a big change in the legislature, we were able to get this passed.
So at this point, my understanding is that this law protects life from the point of conception. Do I have that right, or do I not have that right? Because as I read it myself, it basically attached definitions to protecting life as both a fetus and an embryo, and then different medical literature sort of attaches the embryo stage at a different point as well. Some medical literature says that an unborn child is an embryo right from the point of conception, and then some others say that there are these other stages before the embryo stage. Was it your intention that this basically protect life from the point of conception?
Yes, it was, because this is a woman that had chosen to have a child, and it was wrongfully either, and the bill reads homicide or assault, so either one if the child is harmed.
And ultimately, I think by the most recent count I was able to find from the National Conference of State Legislatures, this is a similar law to what's on the books, I think, in 38 other states at this point. So you're not an outlier in Tennessee for having a law like this. This is part of the majority approach at this point.
That's right. Hopefully, we were ahead of everybody else and showed them the way. But I'm glad to hear that many states have adopted this law.
The question, I suppose, that's up for debate in a number of these states is just exactly at what point to attach the legal protection, because there are some states that don't attach protection to an unborn child right at the point of conception. There are some that attach it at the point of viability, which is the same language that the U.S. Supreme Court uses in basically attaching protection to life from abortion. It used to be that we had this trimester approach, but then more recent cases in the U.S. Supreme Court said that a child can't be aborted at the point it's in theory able to live outside the mother's womb on its own at some point through the help of medical technology, which from my pediatrician friends I've learned just basically keeps getting pushed back earlier and earlier and earlier in development. So some states have just turned around and said, look, we want to attach the protection at the point of viability. Did that cross anyone's mind in Tennessee to potentially do it that way? And regardless of whether it did or didn't, do you think that that's a proper approach? My guess is no.
I really don't think that's a proper approach, because even, if it was right after conception, that woman has chosen to have a child, and she's been deprived because of a wrongdoing.
And I know a few other states have taken this step to say, well, we're not going to try to attach criminal liability to the death of an unborn child unless the perpetrator has at least some knowledge that the mother was pregnant or should have known. In other words, the woman was visibly pregnant. Do you think that parameter, I know Colorado does it that way, that there can't be a conviction unless someone specifically knows that the mother is pregnant or should have known the mother is pregnant? Some actually divide it up that way. My understanding is that the Tennessee approach that you helped author is a much broader approach than that second possibility as well.
Right. In the case in Tennessee that happened because of that, to cause us to pass this law, was a woman who was walking down Church Street, and a drunk driver left the road, ran onto the sidewalk, and killed her. So there's no way he would have had knowledge that she was pregnant, probably.
So that explains the way the law was written the way it was. But it's interesting from my perspective, sitting here observing these different laws in action, is just how different states have led to different legislative conclusions about this issue. And look, it's a hot button issue. It's an issue that divides people from conservative and liberal political sides of the aisle. It divides Republicans, it divides Democrats, and it divides states. As I've said, you're in the majority approach at this point in Tennessee. 38 states have at least some legal protection for an unborn child when it comes to a criminal act, but not all states do. And just watching the way state legislators sort of slice and dice the issue is interesting, because in this case that we just covered here on the Law and Crime Network, the defendant was able to be convicted because the Tennessee approach is a broad protection for the life of an unborn child. In other states, there wouldn't have even been a charge on that count. And I think that it's interesting for observers who watch trials, as our audience does, to just see, hey, well, wait a minute, there's a third charge attached in this case, basically because the legislature agreed as to a moral conclusion about this issue.
Well, and it is a moral conclusion. People try to make it about abortion. It's not about abortion. Again, it's about a woman who has chosen to have her baby, and because of a wrongful act, she is not, the baby has been either hurt or killed, and so they should be charged.
In the case that we just covered, the unborn child was about 6 to 8 weeks along, according to the medical examiner, but the prosecutor didn't get the defendant on the top charge. The jury, one could argue, may have batted this issue back and forth and reached a compromise verdict. A lot of people think that's what happened, because the prosecutor didn't get the top charge in the Shelby Isaac case that we just covered here. The prosecutor got second-degree murder as to the death of the boyfriend, reckless homicide as to the death of the girlfriend, and criminally negligent homicide as to the death of the unborn child. But there was a conviction. It wasn't the top charge. It was a lesser charge as to the death of the unborn child for criminally negligent homicide. And I know that you're in the position of being a legislator, now a candidate for governor, but can you understand the way that the jury may have reached a compromise in this case, but ultimately still chose to convict for the death of that unborn child?
You know, I guess I can. I'm not real familiar with that case, but no matter how you slice it, the woman's child was killed that she was carrying.
Yes, it's good to see this. It's good to have this discussion because different states would look at the issue different ways. Tennessee protects life from the point of conception, as former Senator Beavers, now candidate for governor, has pointed out. One last question, Senator, former Senator, I should say, current candidate. I know that you said you're cooking some wonderful treats for Thanksgiving. Is the Law and Crime audience invited?
Of course. We all make enough for everybody.
I had best let you get back to that, as many people watching probably are in the midst of doing as well. So Mae Beavers, Republican candidate for governor in Tennessee, former state senator, sponsor of the bill that ultimately led to one of the counts turning into a conviction against Shelby Isaac, a defendant whose case we covered here on Law and Crime. Thanks a lot for joining us today.
Thank you.